Millionaire comes home and finds his maid teaching his son how to cook. The home of Alexander Hayes stood tall on the edge of the city, a masterpiece of architecture so flawless it seemed to leave no room for life. Every detail was orderly, each line precise as if drawn straight from the sketches its owner, an acclaimed architect, was known for. To outsiders, it was a dream house. But for those who stepped inside, the first thing they felt was not warmth, but silence and cold. Since the day his wife passed away, Alexander had turned this place into a fortress of control. He kept everything in perfect order, as though the smallest shift might bring his world crashing down. He was used to commanding, to controlling, to living within towering walls where the sound of a child's laughter no longer existed. The one most affected was his 8-year-old son, Ethan. Since losing his mother, Ethan had retreated into himself. He no longer spoke much, nor did he smile. He moved through the vast house like a small shadow, silent in the endless hallways, his eyes carrying a lost search for something that was gone. Alexander saw it all, yet felt powerless. He believed discipline and stability were what his son needed, but deep inside, he knew he was failing. Then, on an early autumn afternoon, Clara Moreno arrived at the heavy iron gates of the mansion. She carried only a modest suitcase and a quiet determination in her eyes. Clara was not wealthy, nor did she hold status. She had come simply as a housekeeper, but she brought with her something the house had been missing for far too long: gentleness. The moment she stepped across the threshold, Clara sensed what others might overlook. Though polished and perfect, the place lacked the breath of life. And there, at the end of the hallway, she saw Ethan for the first time. A thin boy, curled up, fingers fidgeting with an old toy, his eyes never lifting when a stranger softly called his name. In that instant, Clara understood she was not just walking into a house. She was stepping into a world waiting to be awakened. On her first day in that house, Clara quickly realized she should not begin with questions. She did not ask Ethan if he liked school, did not ask what he wanted to play, nor did she force him to answer. His eyes alone told her that every question would only become a burden. Instead, Clara walked into the kitchen, a room that seemed built only to serve perfection and cleanliness, not to be lived in. Wooden shelves polished to a shine, knives and forks arranged with cold precision. But Clara was undaunted. She opened a cupboard, took out a bag of flour, some sugar, a few eggs, and began speaking in a soft voice as if talking to herself. "I'm thinking of making something really delicious, but it's a bit hard to do alone." The spoon clinked lightly against the bowl, the scent of flour spreading through the air. Ethan still sat in the hallway, his head lowered, but Clara knew he was listening. She continued, this time with a touch of playfulness. "Ethan, do you know how to crack an egg with one hand?" The boy lifted his head slightly, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Clara smiled, not rushing, only stirring the batter, giving him time to decide on his own. Minutes later, the soft scrape of a chair sounded across the floor. Ethan walked closer, his steps timid, but his gaze less distant than before. Clara placed an egg in his hand. "Try it?" Ethan carefully tapped the egg against the bowl. A shard of shell fell in, and he froze, eyes wide, waiting for scolding. But Clara laughed, scooped out the shell with a spoon, and said, "See, that's the best part." For the first time in a long while, Ethan's lips curved upward. A shy smile, but enough for a small light to seep into the room that had been silent for too long. From that moment, the kitchen changed. Ethan began to stir the batter, his little hands trembling but persistent. Clara told him simple stories of her childhood, about the first time she baked with her grandmother. He listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes revealing a spark of curiosity in his eyes. When flour dusted his cheek, Ethan chuckled softly. That sound filled the kitchen, once ruled only by the cold clatter of cutlery, and Clara felt as if she had uncovered a precious secret. The door suddenly opened. Alexander had returned earlier than usual. He froze at the threshold, his sharp, familiar eyes fixed on the scene before him. Flour scattered on the table, broken eggshells, and his son, Ethan, smiling. How many months had it been since Alexander last saw that smile? He said nothing, just stood still, watching. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Clara felt his gaze but remained silent. She knew this was a moment that needed no explanation. Ethan kept smiling, carefree, unaware of his father's presence. And Alexander, for the first time in years, realized that something was changing, not only in this kitchen, but inside his own heart. In the days that followed, Clara didn't try to change too much. She didn't force Ethan to speak, nor did she attempt to break into the silence he seemed so accustomed to. Instead, she created small rituals, simple but steady. Every afternoon at the same hour, Clara would step into the kitchen. She never called for Ethan, never signaled, only left the door open. The aroma of sizzling onions, fresh bread, or steaming soup would drift down the long hallway. And often, before long, a small shadow appeared in the doorway, quietly watching. At first, Ethan only peeked in, clutching his old toy tightly. Clara carried on, slicing vegetables, softly humming an old tune. She didn't look his way, didn't call his name. She let her presence itself become a quiet invitation. By the third day, Ethan took a step further. He stopped right beside the counter, his curious eyes following the rhythm of Clara's knife. She smiled gently, slid the wooden spoon toward him, and asked softly, "Would you like to stir?" Ethan hesitated, then reached for it. For the first time, his small hands wrapped around the handle, stirring the pot of hot soup. At first, his movements were clumsy, but soon enough, he found his own rhythm. Clara didn't correct him, didn't command. She simply kept adding ingredients, letting him feel it for himself. From then on, the kitchen slowly became a sanctuary. The sound of chopping, the scent of spices, and Clara's little stories, like soft raindrops, filled the silence. Ethan didn't say much, but each time he giggled when flour stuck to his fingers or when soup bubbled over, Clara knew he was opening up, piece by piece. Alexander began to notice. At first, it was only the faint sound of laughter as he walked past the hallway. The sound was so foreign it made him pause. Then, on other nights, he lingered at the kitchen door, watching quietly. He saw his son no longer sitting alone in shadows, but leaning eagerly over the counter, sprinkling flour across the surface. He saw Clara never impose, only patient, gentle, letting the boy set the pace. In the warm light of the kitchen, Alexander recognized a small but undeniable change. The walls of silence around Ethan were beginning to crack. And here, within a kitchen once filled only with cold, was becoming the beating heart of the home. One quiet morning, while Clara was organizing an old drawer in the kitchen, she came across a small folded piece of paper tucked between worn dish towels. The paper was creased, its edges frayed as if someone had held it too many times. She opened it carefully, as though afraid to damage something precious. The handwriting was uneven, shaky, the unmistakable scrawl of a child. Clara read each word slowly, and her heart tightened at once. "I'm sorry I didn't eat dinner yesterday. I promise I'll be better. Please don't be sad, Mom." Just a few short lines, yet they carried more weight than any explanation ever could. Clara imagined Ethan sitting quietly, struggling to write to a mother who was no longer there to read it. The sorrow woven into each word was far too heavy for an 8-year-old to bear. Her hand lingered on the paper, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. In that moment, Clara understood that Ethan's silence was not stubbornness, nor simply a shy habit. It was a form of self-punishment. The boy was carrying grief too large for his small heart, unable to give it voice. Clara folded the note back, placing it exactly where she had found it. She had no intention of telling Alexander, nor of bringing it up to Ethan. It was too private a secret, a fragment of the child's inner world he wasn't ready to share. But from that moment, the way Clara saw Ethan changed. Each time she watched him sit quietly at the dining table, she no longer saw just silence. She saw a small heart straining under the weight of sadness it should never have had to hold. And so Clara became more patient, more gentle, determined to show him that not every mistake required an apology and that he deserved love even in his most fragile moments. She knew that little note would remain with her always, a quiet reminder of the responsibility she had unwittingly taken on the day she stepped into this house. That afternoon, the sky turned to heavy gray. Gusts of wind shook the garden trees, their leaves rustling wildly. As Clara was tidying up in the kitchen, the ceiling light flickered once, then went out. The house plunged into darkness, filled only with the roar of wind and the pounding of rain against the windows. Before she could react, hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide, fists gripping the hem of his shirt. His face was pale in the dim light, his breath quick and shallow. Clara didn't need to ask. She remembered Alexander once saying that Ethan's mother had died on a stormy day. For the boy, thunder was not just a sound of nature, it was a wound of memory. Clara quickly knelt to meet his gaze, her voice soft, yet firm. "It's all right. I'm here with you." The boy trembled, his eyes clinging to Clara's as if afraid she might vanish. She swiftly rummaged through a drawer, pulling out a few small flashlights. But instead of handing one directly to Ethan, she smiled gently, reaching for several empty glass jars from the cupboard. She switched the flashlights on, placed them inside the jars, and whispered, "These are jars of stars. They'll light our way." A gentle glow spread across the hallway, reflections shimmering softly on the walls. Ethan's eyes widened, fear slowly giving way to curiosity. Clara lined the jars along the floor, creating a faint glowing path like a miniature galaxy. "See?" Clara said softly, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "The dark isn't so frightening. It just needs a little light to become something beautiful." Ethan nodded slightly, then sat beside her, leaning against the wall. He still clutched his small toy, but his shoulders eased. Clara began humming a familiar tune, the lullaby her grandmother used to sing. Her voice was quiet, not perfect, but steady and warm. The storm raged outside, thunder cracking across the sky, but in that narrow hallway there was only soft light and a soothing song. Ethan relaxed, his head resting against Clara's arm, his breathing steadied, his eyelids heavy. Just then, the front door opened. Alexander returned, his shirt soaked through, his hair dripping from the rain. He stopped when he saw the dim glow spilling from the hallway. Stepping closer, he froze at the sight. Ethan asleep in Clara's arms, surrounded by jars of shimmering light. A strange feeling welled in Alexander's chest. He had always thought protecting his son meant building a safe world, keeping everything in order. But now, looking at this scene, he realized safety was never enough. Ethan needed more than strong walls. He needed someone to hold his fear, and that Alexander had not been able to give. He stood there for a long time. In the sound of the rain and the quiet glow, he saw clearly. It wasn't the storm outside that was the real danger, but the emptiness in his son's heart, and somehow Clara was filling that emptiness. One late morning, as Clara was preparing a lunch in the kitchen, Ethan spoke up unexpectedly. His voice was small and cautious, as if each word required great courage to escape. "Mom used to take care of the flowers in the glass room at the end of the hallway." Clara paused, turning to look at him. It was the first time Ethan had mentioned his mother so directly. She didn't press further, only nodded gently, allowing the words to settle into the silence. That afternoon, Clara followed the long corridor to the back of the house. A pair of dust-frosted glass doors stood before her, their rusty hinges groaning as she pushed them open. Inside was a long-forgotten winter garden. Pots of withered plants drooped lifelessly, the soil hardened and pale. Sunlight streamed through the tall glass panels, casting beams across floating dust. The space felt frozen in memory. A few days later, Ethan appeared with a small watering can in hand. He lingered at the doorway, then quietly stepped inside. Clara didn't ask questions. She simply smiled, handed him a cloth, and together they began wiping the thick dust from the leaves. In the days that followed, they brought packets of seeds found in storage, carefully planting them into the dry soil. Ethan decided what to grow and where, while Clara quietly followed his lead. Gradually, the garden began to change. Green crept back onto fragile branches, and the scent of damp earth drifted through the air. Ethan walked with more confidence now, no longer shrinking into himself. He told Clara the names of flowers his mother once loved, describing them from memory. The bright red roses, the cascading wisteria that hung like a purple waterfall. Clara listened, letting the boy guide her. One afternoon, as Clara pressed soil around a fragile new sprout, Alexander appeared in the doorway. He stood silently, his eyes fixed on the sight of his son bending down to water a plant, his face calm and intent. The scene pulled old memories to the surface, his late wife, their shared moments tending this very room, the sound of laughter once filling the glass walls. It had been so long since the garden had known life. And this time, the life returning wasn't just in the plants, it was in the child as well. Alexander didn't step inside right away. He only stood there, listening to the trickle of water, the soft rustle of small hands working the soil, and realized Clara was giving Ethan what he himself hadn't known how to create. New memories, not to replace the past, but to begin healing it. One still afternoon, while Clara was wiping down the kitchen counter, Ethan entered holding a white envelope. He didn't speak right away, only stood before her, his eyes carrying a seriousness unusual for his age. I drew this for Mom, Ethan whispered, then hesitated as he placed the envelope in Clara's hands. But she can't see it, so I want you to see it first. Clara carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a sheet of paper filled with colored pencil drawings. The lines were uneven, imperfect, yet they held the boy's entire world. In the picture were 4 figures, a tall man, a woman with long hair, a small boy, and another woman standing beside them. Above, the mother was drawn among blue clouds, her arms stretched wide as if to protect them. At the bottom, in shaky, uneven letters, Ethan had written, "We're okay now, she helped." Clara felt her throat tighten. She looked down at Ethan's expectant eyes and understood that he had poured all the feelings he could not voice into this page. It was more than just a drawing. It was proof that in his tender heart the pain had finally found a place to soften. She bent down and whispered softly, "It's beautiful, Ethan, truly beautiful." At that moment, Alexander entered. Ethan quickly ran to him, holding out the drawing. Alexander took it, surprise flickering in his gaze. When his eyes reached the words at the bottom, his hand froze. His eyes blinked rapidly, but tears still broke free. For years, he had refused to let himself appear weak before anyone. But this time, he didn't hide. Ethan wrapped his arms tightly around his father. Alexander's large hand trembled as he held his son close, as if afraid that letting go might mean losing something precious. And in his other hand, he still gripped the drawing, the paper trembling with emotion. Clara stepped back, quietly observing. That afternoon, the golden light of sunset spread across the backyard lawn. Ethan ran with a small ball in his hands, laughter echoing through the garden. Clara chased after him, pretending to catch him, while Ethan darted away with excited little steps. Alexander stepped onto the porch, sleeves rolled up, his face less tense than usual. He watched for a moment before asking suddenly, "Is there room for one more player?" Ethan cheered, "Yes," and tossed the ball toward his father. Alexander caught it, immediately joining in. No longer the stern man of habit, he became a quick opponent, blocking Ethan's path, pretending to stumble, waving his arms clumsily to make his son laugh harder. Clara joined in as well, passing the ball to Ethan, teaming up with him to outmaneuver Alexander. The three of them moved in circles, chasing and laughing, their joy filling the yard. It had been so long since this house had known such sounds, free, lively, carrying the breath of family. In one sudden moment, Clara passed the ball to Ethan, but Alexander lunged to intercept. His step slipped on the grass still damp with dew. Clara reached out instinctively to steady him, but instead of catching him, they both tumbled to the ground together. Laughter erupted, ringing in the air. Ethan stood nearby, clutching his stomach as he laughed at the sight of his father and Clara sprawled across each other. Yet amid the laughter, Clara felt Alexander's hand still holding firmly onto her arm. The space between them shrank until she could see his eyes clearly, no longer cold, but softened, filled with an unfamiliar curiosity. They were silent. Time seemed to pause. Then, as if by instinct, Alexander leaned closer. Clara didn't turn away. It was a light, fleeting touch, but enough to shift everything. A kiss unexpected, fragile, like a sweet mistake. Immediately they both pulled back, eyes darting away. Alexander spoke first, his voice low but firm. "That shouldn't have happened. You're too important to Ethan. We have to keep things as they are." Clara nodded, her face calm though her thoughts swirled. They stood, brushing grass from their clothes, and resumed the game with Ethan as though nothing had occurred. But both knew, without words, the boundary had been crossed. And even though the kiss was brief, its echo would not be easily erased. In the days following the fleeting kiss, the air between Alexander and Clara shifted. They still spoke, but their words carried caution. They still worked together to care for Ethan, but an invisible distance lingered. Clara kept her professionalism. Alexander tried for composure. Yet both knew they were avoiding something within themselves. One afternoon, while discussing Ethan's studies, the tension broke into argument. "The boy needs more discipline," Alexander insisted firmly. "He can't live only on games and stories in the kitchen," Clara replied, gentle but unwavering. "Ethan needs to feel safe before he can learn anything. He's already lost too much. The last thing he needs is more pressure." Their eyes locked, silence hanging heavy. Neither yielded. And in that moment, neither noticed that Ethan had slipped quietly out of the living room. When Clara called his name, no answer came. She glanced around. The room was empty. Alexander shot up, searching the kitchen, the garden, but found nothing. Their voices echoed through the vast house, growing more frantic with every passing second. Then a memory flickered in Clara's mind. Ethan had once spoken of the old glass house at the far end of the garden, a place tied to his mother. Her heart tightened. Without a word, she ran into the graying evening. The path was strewn with dry leaves, leading to a pair of dusty glass doors. The hinges groaned as she pushed them open. Inside, faint light filtered through aged panes. In the far corner, among cobwebbed pots, a small figure sat curled up, trembling. "Ethan," Clara called softly, her voice trembling but warm. The boy looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "I thought you were going to leave, like Mom." Clara's breath caught. She knelt down, extending her hand, palm open. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm here because of you. No one's forcing me. No conditions. I choose to stay." At that moment, footsteps echoed behind her. Alexander appeared in the doorway, his face tense, then softening as he saw his son. He moved closer, kneeling to meet Ethan's eyes. "I'm sorry," Alexander said quietly. "No one will make Clara leave. She belongs here, just like you. I promise." Ethan's gaze shifted from father to Clara. Then slowly, he placed his small hand into Clara's. In that instant, the tension dissolved, replaced by a fragile new understanding. The three of them left the glass house together, walking toward the fading light of day. And in Clara's heart, she knew. This time, Ethan had placed his trust not only in her, but also in his father. In the weeks that followed, Clara kept her familiar routines, working in the kitchen, tending the garden, and sitting by Ethan's bedside at night. But inside her, a heavy thought grew. Was her presence truly right for them? Each day she noticed Alexander keeping his distance. He rarely lingered in the kitchen, rarely let his eyes rest on her too long. Between them, that brief kiss lingered like a crack. Clara knew she had become something more than a housekeeper to Ethan, and it was precisely that which frightened her. If it all fell apart, what would become of the boy? One early morning, while the house still slept, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table. Before her were 2 envelopes, one for Ethan with carefully written words. "You are a brave boy. Always believe that you deserve love. Take care of the winter garden, because it's just like you. It needs time and patience to bloom." The other was for Alexander, shorter but honest. "I believe leaving is the best for all of us. Thank you for letting me be part of your lives." Clara folded the letters, placed them neatly on the table, and picked up her small bag. Outside, the rain had begun, tapping against the windows. She slipped on her coat, took her umbrella, and walked the long, familiar hallway. Each step felt heavier, as though part of her was being torn away from this place. At the great gate at the end of the garden, she stopped. Her hand trembled as she slid the key into the lock. Just then, a voice called out through the rain. "Clara!" She turned, startled, to see 2 figures running toward her. Ethan was in front, clutching a piece of cardboard. Rain soaked it, curling the edges, but the bold letters still showed. "Please stay." Behind him, Alexander ran hard, his shirt drenched, hair plastered to his forehead. His breath was ragged, but his eyes steady. Ethan reached her first, holding the sign high, his eyes pleading, "You said you wouldn't leave me." Clara's hands shook, her umbrella slipping away. The rain was cold, but her throat burned hot with emotion. Alexander stepped closer, his voice cutting clearly through the storm. "We don't need perfect, we just need you." In that moment, Clara understood. Leaving wasn't protecting anyone, it was only running from her own fear. But here, before her, was a boy holding on to her hand, and a man finally admitting what he had never dared to say. Clara knelt down, pulling Ethan into her arms. "All right, I'll stay." Ethan's face lit up, smiling through tears. Alexander exhaled deeply, as if releasing a long-held weight. He took Clara's bag, slinging it over his shoulder, and said softly, "Let's go home." The 3 walked back together along the rain-soaked path. Ethan clutched Clara's hand tightly, unwilling to let go. And in that moment, though the storm poured down around them, Clara felt only one thing inside: peace. After that rainy day, the atmosphere in the house seemed to change. The silent walls now breathed warmth. Clara was no longer just a housekeeper, she was a natural part of the family. In the afternoons, the kitchen lights came on earlier than before. Ethan no longer stood quietly at the doorway. Instead, he climbed onto chairs, fetched bowls, held spoons, and sometimes reminded Clara, "You forgot to add salt." He laughed more now, his cheeks flushed, his eyes bright with eagerness. Clara let him handle small tasks, whisking eggs, stirring batter, sprinkling sugar on cakes. Sometimes flour scattered across the counter, but instead of frustration, laughter filled the room. Alexander, too, began to stop by more often, not just watching from afar, but joining in. One evening, he took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and snatched the whisk from Clara's hand. He stirred with exaggerated seriousness, making Ethan burst into uncontrollable laughter. Watching the scene, Clara felt a strange warmth rise within her. This was family, not bound by perfection, but built in simple, messy moments. When their first cake finished baking, Ethan ran to fetch an old camera from a drawer. He eagerly set it on the counter, switched to the timer. "We need a picture," he announced. Clara stood on the left, Alexander on the right, Ethan wedged in between, gripping both their hands tightly. In the brief second before the camera clicked, Alexander and Clara looked at each other, silent, yet both aware of the long journey that had led them here. The photo was later placed in a worn wooden frame Ethan had found. He set it on the kitchen counter where anyone passing by could see it. The image wasn't perfect, a corner was slightly blurred, the frame scratched, but it held the most precious thing, their genuine smiles. That evening, as the three of them shared slices of warm cake, Clara looked up and saw Alexander's eyes. They no longer carried tension, but peace. A quiet acknowledgement that this house had, at last, rediscovered its laughter. Time passed quietly, yet the house was no longer the same. Once filled with silence, it now pulsed with voices, laughter, and the everyday music of life. The steady rhythm of a knife against the cutting board, Ethan's footsteps echoing through the halls, and the scratch of Alexander's pencil across blueprints, always pausing for a smile when he looked up to see the two people he loved most. Ethan had changed. He was no longer the withdrawn boy hiding in corners. Now he ran through the winter garden, proudly pointing out each new sprout. He shared stories about school, about little things in his day, and sometimes even debated seriously with Alexander about math problems. Clara saw in his eyes a new confidence, a spark of life that 2 years ago would have been unimaginable. And Alexander had changed too. The man who once clung to order and control had finally learned to pause, to breathe, and to embrace the clumsy yet genuine moments that made life real. He was no longer just an architect designing perfect houses on paper. He was a father and a man learning to build a true home. 2 years passed. On an early summer morning in the winter garden where so many memories had taken root, a simple wedding was held. There were no grand rituals, only the flowers tended by Clara and Ethan, the fragrance of damp earth, sunlight streaming through tall panes of glass, and a long table dressed in white. Ethan carried the rings. Proudly, he stepped forward, handing one to his father and one to Clara, his eyes glowing with joy. When Alexander slid the ring onto Clara's hand, he didn't speak grand words, only whispered, "At last, we've found our family. Not perfect, but truly ours." Clara smiled, her eyes glistening. In that moment, the past, its pain, loss, and emptiness, seemed to fade, replaced by a warm, steady present. Their wedding photo was taken right there in the winter garden, with Ethan in the middle, holding both their hands. And this time, no shaky handwriting was needed to say, "We're okay now." Because they all knew. They truly were. The house that once echoed with silence had found its heart again, not in perfection, but in love, in laughter, and in the quiet, steadfast choice they made each day to remain together.